think one of the most degrading and disrespectful things that parents can do is call their children out of their name or curse at them. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones. I've been counseling men and women for many years who have experienced abuse or have been perpetrators of abuse. And way back when I was in grad school, I did a dissertation study on Black women who were psychologically abused by their parents while growing up. And what a lot of the women in there talked about in that study was how their mothers in particular would curse at them and call them out of their name. Specifically, their mothers would call them bitches and, would, basically curse them out in strong, profane language that was just humiliating and degrading and embarrassing. And a lot of them talked about, how their mothers would, curse them out in public or in front of people and all of this kind of stuff. And a lot of these Black women talked about, how hurtful it was that their mother would just, call them bitch. And, if you're Black, then you know that there's several ways that you can say the word bitch and it can mean several different things, right? But in the way that it was expressed to them, it was always like, you're pathetic, who do you think you are? You're the scum of the earth type of thing. And a lot of them talked about just how like their mother would just refer to them as that on a regular basis, and also, just curse them out in, or, refer to them by, if it wasn't bitch, their mothers would refer to them by an insecurity or, I don't like to use the word defect, but they consider it like a defect or a handicap. So their mothers would refer to them like one woman was, she didn't have a whole lot of hair. And so her mother would call her, Baldania and, would use that to shame her. They lived in an apartment and she would kind of go through the apartment, like yelling that name. And so why this is significant, a lot of these women talked about how hurtful it was because that name calling, that sort of stuck with them over the years, and they sort of thought of themselves in that way as like someone who is not worthy, who's not beautiful, someone who doesn't deserve respect. And this would translate over into their relationships as they got older, even with friends, but especially with their significant others. Where their significant others would call them names and would, refer to them by an insecurity and be completely degrading publicly and sort of calling them names like that and cursing them out publicly. But the other caveat is this, a lot of the women who then became mothers talked about how this then, although they knew that what their mother was doing was wrong, it was inherently cruel and that they didn't like it, and it wasn't something that they ever wanted to do themselves. Unfortunately, it was a behavior that many of them internalized after it had been modeled to them for so many years. And so when they then had their own daughters, guess what they were doing? They were calling their daughters bitches and things like that. And being completely disrespectful with curse words and degrading their daughters and just basically putting their daughters down any chance that they got. And again, logically, they knew that it was wrong and it was something that they hated about themselves. but they just could not get themselves to stop. Like it was like, they were fighting themselves, but they could not get themselves to stop because it had been hammered into them, and they found themselves being uncontrollably angry and just disrespectful towards their daughters for no reason. And so it was truly an intergenerational cycle. And and in some cases, it had gotten so bad with these women and their daughters that, there was a rift. And not only that, I think they, from what I recall, and again, this was years ago, some of them were doing this to their daughters when their daughters were extremely young. So their daughters were like 3 or 4 years old. And so they were being very antagonistic, being very disrespectful and degrading and verbally abusive, quite frankly, to their daughters. And, when I was interviewing these women, they became very tearful about it, and they knew that it was wrong. But they didn't know how to stop. And a lot of them, were still in contact with their mothers. So they had regular contact with their mothers and still had this animosity with their mothers, over their mothers calling them names and whatnot. But, just so you know, and so name calling, and I don't use the word bitch. I have used it before, but I don't use it. And so I think name calling, but cursing at and disrespecting your children definitely has a longer lasting impact than most people realize. And sometimes parents intend to hurt their children by using this sort of verbiage. Sometimes they do want to cut their children to the white meat, but sometimes others are just like, they can't stop it, even though they very much want to. But it has a long-lasting impact. It does affect self-esteem. It affects their own communication. It affects what they normalize in terms of communication. I think the word bitch, unfortunately, has gotten to be quite normalized when you think about Afro-centered movies or media, especially in black music or hip hop music. It's, movies and things like that. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, to see black women being referred to as that, and black women even referring to each other as that. But it's extremely hurtful, and it definitely has detrimental consequences, because there's not much of a gap between someone verbally calling you that, to someone hitting you, to someone sexually abusing you, to someone financially abusing you. So there's not a whole lot of, if a person is going to do that and be disrespectful to you in the worst way, it's not a stretch to think that could extend to other types of abuse as well. Hope that helps. Thanks so much for watching. Like, comment, follow, and share.